Tom. Okay, so welcome everybody to our afternoon panel. After we just heard a couple of papers in which Kropotkin was subject to harsh critique by other anarchists, and now we will delve into one of the concepts that I think attracted many people to Kropotkin and his thought in the first place, namely mutual aid, and more specifically mutual aid now. So in his Anarchy in Action, Colin Ward says about mutual aid, Kropotkin's continuing hold upon people's minds was due to the realistic quality of his work. Mutual aid describes actual human experience and is in line with existing and powerful aspirations. Mutual aid clarifies past and present experience. It is a cooperator's classic, a book that may yet help to make an epoch. So the three papers we're about to hear all delve into the nature of this actual human experience as they assess the role of mutual aid as an evolutionary principle, a model of organization and behavior, and a very concrete set of practices that we can observe today and that we can participate in today in many cases. So Dugatkin will begin by laying some conceptual groundwork in his paper on Kropotkin's law of mutual aid and evolutionary perspective, in which he traces Kropotkin's account of natural selection. Afterwards, Claudia Firth will explore the relationship of the state, organization, and technology to decentralized grassroots initiatives such as the COVID-19 mutual aid groups, CMAGs. And finally, Tom Pewton will continue in this vein of current practice by introducing us to a London cooperative founded in 2001, which, as he argues, displays traits of Kropotkin's theory of mutual aid, solidarity, enthusiasm, sacrifice, cooperation, and, of course, community. So, but before we look at these practical applications and modes of organization now, please, Lee, introduce us to the evolutionary perspective on mutual aid. The stage is yours.
Very good, thank you. So let me see here. Can you see what I want you to be seeing? That first slide. Now.
Yes. Perfect.
Okay. I just can't tell from my screen. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I've been looking forward to this. So I'm an evolutionary biologist and historian of science, and so I come at Kropotkin from that perspective, and particularly how his evolutionary ideas on mutual aid developed. And so I think this talk is hopefully a good setup for the talks that follow, in the sense that I'm totally going to be concentrating on how Kropotkin developed these ideas in the context of non-humans, and then I hope that the next talks will take off and explain how these ideas are then have been and are continuing to be used to understand mutual aid in humans. And so I'm going to start by just outlining when Kropotkin first started dabbling with evolutionary ideas. And that was when he was a teenage page to Alexander II. And what had happened was that his older brother, Sasha, had introduced Peter Kropotkin to these ideas of evolutionary change. So soon after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Sasha heard a professor of zoology give 3 lectures on transformism, which was essentially the word that the professor was using for Darwin's ideas on evolution by natural selection. And it wasn't long before both brothers were reading and writing about Darwinian ideas, evolutionary concepts. But this is just how Kropotkin got interested in evolutionary ideas, not yet mutual aid. So he became more and more interested in Darwinian ideas, and particularly how natural selection operates. And basically the idea that Darwin was putting out was that, you know, you have a struggle between individuals, and those that are best suited to the environment that they live in will reproduce offspring, and the traits that they possess will then increase in frequency. So this is kind of classic Darwinian selection, and this is what Kropotkin was reading and becoming more and more fascinated with. So when he finishes up in the Corps of Pages, because he's sergeant there, he has his choice of appointments when he graduates in 1862. And Kropotkin decides that he wants to go to Siberia in part because he wants to study natural history and Darwin's ideas on natural selection. That wasn't the only reason he wanted to go there, but that was one of the major reasons that he did. So, to the amazement of his peers and to his father, he requests an appointment to the mounted Cossack infantry in the newly annexed Amur region. And Alexander II is also completely baffled by this, but tells Kropotkin, "You want to go to Siberia? Are you not afraid to go so far?" Kropotkin says, "No, this is where I want to go." And the Tsar says, "Okay, well, one can be useful everywhere." So Kropotkin then heads out to Siberia in late July of 1862. And basically, he begins a long, multi-year stint in Siberia where he's sort of crisscrossing back and forth across Russia, 50,000 miles, mostly in Siberia, undertaking what I like to think of is sort of a colder version of Darwin's trip on the Beagle when he went to the Galapagos. And this is just my own rough Google Maps version of the places that that Kropotkin went in Siberia. And in fact, some of these he visited multiple times, and it's difficult to see this, but just gives you a sense of how much traveling he was doing. And a lot of it, particularly in Siberia, he describes as lying full length in a sled, wrapped in fur blankets, fur inside and outside, where the temperature is 40 or 60 degrees below zero. This is how Kropotkin is describing his time there. So when he goes, having been immersed in Darwinian thinking for a bit now, a couple of years, he basically went there assuming that he would see evidence of this struggle for existence that he was reading about. But he writes that I failed to find it, although I was eagerly looking for it. That bitter struggle for the means of existence among animals belonging to the same species, which was considered by most Darwinists, Kropotkin says, as the dominant characteristic of the struggle for life and the main factor of evolution. So if anything, he was predisposed, in fact, to see this, and he doesn't to a large extent. He sees some, but he doesn't see very much. And instead, he sees like animals giving alarm calls to warn one another, herds of animals forming defensive rings to guard individuals against predators, animals sharing food, animals huddling together for warmth, animals playing with one another. And he summarizes this in his mutual aid book by saying, wherever I saw life in abundance, as for instance on the lakes and the colonies of rodents and the migration of birds, the migration of deer, in all these scenes of animal life which passed by my eyes, I saw mutual aid and mutual support carried on to an extent which made me suspect it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. So going there thinking he was going to see the struggle for existence, he comes out, in fact, thinking that instead this notion of mutual aid is the key factor in evolution. He, of course, has seen mutual aid among humans in particularly smaller villages, especially far away from the Tsar's reign of power. But a lot of what drove him to develop his theory of mutual aid was what he was seeing in non-humans and these animals all over. And soon he's basically preaching from a pedestal that this is incredibly important, this notion that mutual aid is the primary evolutionary force. And so again, in his book, Mutual Aid, he says, practice mutual aid. This is the surest means for giving to each and to all the greatest safety, the best guarantee of existence and progress, bodily, intellectually, and morally. This is what nature teaches us. So here he's basically saying this is what we as humans should do, but it's because this is what nature teaches us, and that this is what all those animals which have attained the highest position in their respective classes have done. What he saw in animals helped him develop his theory of mutual aid, which he now says, now look and see, this is what's going on in nature. Surely we can figure out a way to do this as humans. Soon, Kropotkin is speaking of what he refers to as a biological law of mutual aid. He saw this law of mutual aid completely within the light of evolutionary thinking. And he considered himself to be a true Darwinist. He thought that natural selection drove change, which to him, and I think probably accurately, made him think he was a true Darwinist. I mean, natural selection is the primary force in Darwinian models that drive evolutionary change. He thinks that he is then a Darwinist. It's just that instead of the struggle for existence, it's mutual aid that natural selection favors. The way Kropotkin describes it is natural selection favored aggregations of organisms trying to find out the best ways of combining the wants of the individuals with those of cooperation for the welfare of the species. And again, I know that our subsequent speakers are going to get into this in much more detail, but you can see how the ideas that he's developing from evolutionary thinking and from what he's seeing in non-humans is going to have a significant impact on the way he thinks about mutual aid in humans and what should be done to promote it. I'm not going to get into this a lot right here because I want to discuss a couple of important sort of challenges that Kropotkin had when he was developing his ideas. But I do want you to know that while he was doing this and presenting this view that was, he didn't see it as antithetical to Darwinian thinking, but many British scientists did, including Thomas Henry Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog. And so Huxley, at the same time that Kropotkin is discussing his ideas on mutual aid, is writing literature that is infuriating Kropotkin, describing natural selection in the wild as akin to a gladiator show. So in 1888, Kropotkin publishes this article called The Struggle for Existence, a program that's published in 19th Century, which was sort of the magazine for the intelligentsia at the time. So everybody who is anybody published here. This is where ex-prime ministers published. This is where Beatrix Potter published some of her children's stories, and Huxley publishes this essay. And I just want to give you a sense of the way that the British were still thinking about natural selection as wholly this struggle for existence. So here's what Huxley says. From the point of view of the moralists, the animal world is on about the same level as the gladiator show. The creatures are fairly well treated, set to fight. The strongest, the swiftest, and the cunningest live to fight another day. The weakest and the stupidest went to the wall, while the toughest and the shrewdest, those who were best fitted to cope with their circumstances, but not best in any other way, survived. Life was a continuous free fight, and beyond the limited and temporary relations of the family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal state of existence. So again, this is still the dominant view at the time that Kropotkin is developing his ideas on mutual aid, and there's sort of lots of interesting interactions that go on between the Russian camp of mutual aid that Kropotkin is championing, and Huxley and Darwin's view. And I touch on this a little bit on a small book I have on Kropotkin, but I want to sort of move on to some more interesting things, which are two problems that Kropotkin had as he was developing this theory of mutual aid. So he knows what he's been seeing in animals, he understands Darwinian principles, and he thinks that natural selection is favoring mutual aid. But he's somewhat perplexed by two issues that he really needs to be able to address to develop a full theory here. And I want to talk about those two briefly in the next 5 minutes or so I can leave some time for questions. The first one was, what was the mechanism that allowed animals to engage in mutual aid? In other words, what prompted mutual aid in real time? Kropotkin thought he understood the evolutionary processes that operate over generations, But in real time, what prompted an animal to go from not displaying mutual aid to displaying mutual aid? What's the mechanism? The second problem that Kropotkin had was whether or not Darwinian processes operated quickly enough to account for the mutual aid that he was seeing in non-humans. So let's do the first problem, which was, what's the mechanism that allowed animals to engage in mutual aid? And this is a fascinating one because it links to Kropotkin, to somebody that we normally would not think Kropotkin would be linked to, and that is Adam Smith. So long before Adam Smith published his book on that was essentially the birth of modern capitalism, he published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1749. And it was in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that Kropotkin found a mechanism that allowed for mutual aid to occur in real time in animals. So long before The Wealth of Nations, we've got the Theory of Moral Sentiments. I mean, we all know what Kropotkin would think of, thought of the Wealth of Nations, but he was quite a fan of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in fact, in a pamphlet that Kropotkin wrote in 1890 called Anarchist Morality, he lays out how the Theory of Moral Sentiments addresses this question of what's the mechanism, how does it work in real time. And so here's what he says. In this fine work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith has laid his finger on the true origin of the moral sentiment. He does not seek it in mystic religious feelings. He finds it simply in the feeling of sympathy. When Kropotkin talks about sympathy here, I think most people today would in fact think of this more as empathy, but he called it sympathy. So he goes on, you see a man beat a child. You know that the beaten child suffers. Your imagination causes you yourself to suffer the pain inflicted upon the child, or perhaps its tears, its little suffering face tell you. And if you're not a coward, you rush at the brute who is beating it and rescue it from him. This example by itself explains almost all the moral sentiments. So again, this is sort of more what we think of as empathy. You put yourself in the position of somebody else, and if they're in trouble, then you feel that, and that's in part what drives you to act, to stop things that are nasty to whoever's experiencing them. Okay, but so this is just Kropotkin's summary of Adam Smith's ideas, which were all about human moral sentiments. And then Kropotkin continues in his Anarchist Morality pamphlet. Adam Smith's only mistake was not to have understood that the same feeling of sympathy, or what we would call empathy, in its habitual state, that is in its sort of earliest form, when it's instinctual, goes on among animals as well as among men. So basically, Kropotkin is arguing that animals have a sense of empathy, and that this empathy allows them to help others when those others need it. Just as a very quick side point, there's quite a bit of experimental work going on in the field of evolution and animal behavior on empathy. And in fact, in my own lab, we're looking at empathy in rats. And so if anybody has questions about that for whatever reason, we could talk about that in the question and answer too. Okay, so this is how he solves the first problem. The second problem is, could Darwinian processes operate quickly enough to account for mutual aid in animals? And here the problem was that Kropotkin thought that mutual aid arose so quickly in animals that classic Darwinian thinking didn't explain it, because classic Darwinian thinking posits this sort of slow, gradual change in whatever traits are being favored. But when mutual aid appeared, it appeared almost in full force in animals when it first appeared, and in relatively short amounts of time. And so Kropotkin was sort of puzzled how that could happen if classic Darwinian processes were operating. The answer for Kropotkin was, again, to turn to what was already in the literature, but now he's turning to work that was done by Lamarck and relying on this idea called Lamarckian inheritance, or the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So I want to give you sort of a 1-minute tutorial on Lamarckian inheritance, and then we can see how Kropotkin saw it as a solution to this problem of how quickly mutual aid was appearing. So the classic example of Lamarckian inheritance is, imagine giraffes with short necks stretched to reach food. The stretching increases their own neck length. So you can actually, you can change the length of various parts of your body by stretching constantly. Not a lot, but a little bit. Okay, but what Lamarck said was, as a result of this use of this stretching by the parents, offspring that those parents produce have longer necks immediately. In other words, in modern day terms, what Lamarck was saying was that the action at the level of the parental generation changes their genetics, the genetics of the parents, so that when they have offspring, those offspring already have a genetically changed constitution that produces a slightly longer neck in the next generation. Today, we know this process doesn't operate, except in very, very rare instances. But in Kropotkin's time, it was a widely accepted idea. Even Darwin thought it was a real possibility. So this inheritance results in a rapid evolutionary change. So if giraffes in generation X stretch their necks, then in generation X plus 1, we have offspring that already have slightly longer necks. Then if they stretch their necks, and maybe they stretch their necks even a little bit more by use and of trying to reach up to those trees, then their offspring have even longer necks, and they have the genetic predisposition for this. This really speeds up the process of evolution dramatically. You can get quick changes in Lamarckian inheritance. If everybody in the population is stretching their necks, then all their offspring in the next generation are genetically predisposed to have longer necks. Now, think about this with respect to what Kropotkin is interested in, which is mutual aid. If some individuals in generation X display a little bit more mutual aid, then their offspring will have genes associated with displaying more mutual aid. So just the action of the parents, for whatever reason, translates into genetic change so that their offspring are predisposed genetically to display mutual aid. Now imagine lots of individuals in the population do this, and then all their offspring have slightly longer necks and a genetic predisposition. And then those individual offspring grow up and they stretch their necks even longer by use. That changes their genetic constitution to produce offspring who have even longer necks. And again, if everybody is doing this, you can get really rapid evolutionary change, much faster than classic Darwinian thinking. So this kind of Lamarckian inheritance helped Kropotkin solve that second problem, which was the speed at which evolution occurs. And so when I think about Kropotkin's legacy in the life sciences, particularly biology, I think about it as grounding mutual aid squarely in the field of evolutionary biology. And I can say that finally, many evolutionary biologists are recognizing this. So there's been a long history of people studying cooperation and mutual aid in evolutionary biology. But for most of that history, Kropotkin was essentially ignored. And now, because of conferences like this and other conferences, and because of some historians of science explaining Kropotkin's role in the development of these ideas on cooperation, evolutionary biologists are finally turning around and recognizing what an important contribution Kropotkin made. So I think perhaps it would be a good idea if I stop now and then I can take questions. Now, should I stop the screen sharing? Is that probably a good idea? Or is that necessary?
Yes, that's our screen now. We relegated all the questions to the end of the panel.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. So
yeah.
you're going to
so
wait
first.
Got it.
Exactly. Okay. Yes.
Okay, okay. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I thank you guys again for allowing me to tell you a little bit about Kropotkin and evolution.
Thank you very much, Lee.
Very good.
Okay, Claudia. I will now share my screen, and if I am supposed to change the slide, you just give me a quick sign.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about mutual aid in relation to the COVID pandemic, in particular looking at the COVID mutual aid groups. Just one sec, sorry. This isn't a purely empirical study. It steps back just a little bit, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a bit. And I'm trying to connect the present with some previous work that I've done as well, but again, I'll explain a bit. So last March, as the government prevaricated about what to do in the face of the growing pandemic, a myriad of small, very local COVID mutual aid groups, or CMAGs, emerged very quickly on the ground all over the country in order to help people who were sick or who had to isolate. They picked up shopping, collected prescriptions, or other things that people needed if they couldn't go out. Historically speaking, such an emergence and proliferation of grassroots organising coupled with new technologies have been extremely significant and even revolutionary. So I'm thinking here of the emergence of the Soviets, workplace councils during the First World War, where knowledge of these was spread by the new media technologies of the time. In Germany, Italy, Russia, the situation became revolutionary, while arguably becoming pre-revolutionary UK, France, and the US. I think we can pretty much safely say that these particular groups now are not revolutionary in anything like the same way, but I'm very interested, this is partly why I'm very interested in them, because they've kind of emerged in such sort of huge numbers, and I think it's interesting to think about what the implications might be of this mass proliferation of groups, whether they'll just disappear completely, or perhaps mutual aid might be in some way becoming mainstream, and what that might mean. And of course, Kropotkin argued that mutual aid, for it to survive, it couldn't be limited to a small association. It had to spread to its surroundings. And he says, or else the surroundings will absorb the association. So I'm going to look at some of the mechanisms, some of the contemporary mechanisms of absorption, and what, if anything, might escape or persist. Next slide, please. So I'm going to try and, this is kind of a partial bit of what might be termed a conjunctural analysis, which is a cultural studies term, in order to think a bit more about the complexity of the situation. Conjunctural analysis is always partial and incomplete, as is, if you're dealing with the present quite often. Firstly, I want to introduce the concept of conjuncture by way of Kropotkin. So Lee has done a really great job of setting out Kropotkin's evolutionary overview of social cooperation in animals. And of course, he also talked about people within people as an innate trait that countered social Darwinism and Hobbes' state of nature. It is also, especially in the book Mutual Aid, an example of what can be called epochal analysis. So it takes place over the very long duration. And epochal thinking describes kind of ontological or transcendental conditions of existence. It covers the nature of relations, structures, organizations, materialities, and agencies, and modes of being in the world. And we can see this in Kropotkin's approach with his descriptions of precisely the struggles over those modes of being over time, as well as the possibilities for imagination and transformation. A crisis, on the other hand, is a more acute temporal juncture. So it's a kind of overdetermined moment, even if it lasts for a period of time. It's a time of intense difficulty, a turning point, or a point of decision. And it has been argued that an analysis which just stays on the level of the moment is perhaps a not very effective approach if one is looking for effective interventions for social change. So the conjuncture lies somewhere between the epoch and the moment. And of course, crises don't come out of nowhere. So Stuart Hall has said that a moment of potential change is a time when contradictions that are always at play in any historical moment are condensed. So there's an accumulation or a condensation of contradictions, which creates this kind of overdetermination. So you can see the conjunctural analysis treats everything as contextual and relationally constituted, and it needs to take some of the larger scale, temporal, epochal aspects into account. So therefore, by tracing what's new and emerging, what's becoming mainstream, and what's old and disappearing, there's an attempt to try and excavate the conditions of the present. So it's like a kind of history of the present in some kind of way. So my main focus for this talk is on tracing the use of platform technology and its connection with social cooperation. And I'm going to place it in the context of neoliberal governmentality. Next slide, please. So on an anarchist bookshop blog, Anna Kleist, who was one of the activists who set up one of the very first COVID mutual aid groups in Lewisham in London, and she set it up in order to help people to look out for one another rather than as a revolutionary act. Even though she's very aware of Kropotkin and his ideas. So she recounts how these groups very quickly went viral. Hundreds and then thousands of local groups were set up to help neighbours, flyers distributed, and we've got some examples that the previous slide was also a flyer. And there were many more people who signed up to help than help that was actually needed. And so you can see here, this is a quote from a really nice publication from the Mayday Rooms, that more than 4,000 groups were formed by May 2020, so incredibly quickly. Next slide, please. So while starting out very incredibly lo-fi with an old phone, generally the groups were organised by area and split into many very small micro-organised WhatsApp groups, so on the level of the street or the block. They are often coordinated by Slack, which is a social media workstream app. And then a website was set up, which provided a very simple platform for locating and making visible the network of groups that was emerging. And the website, states that they just exist in order to provide the resources in order to help the groups flourish. They're not in charge of the network. So platform technology facilitated or enabled this proliferation and visibility of groups, and I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So before I go on to talk more about that, oh, is there not one? Yeah, that's it. No, previous, go back. There was one there on politics. Yeah, it's after this one. Yeah, that's it. Great, thank you. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the internal politics within the COVID mutual aid groups. So, and I'm using here reports from a variety of different sources, including an activist inquiry by the New Socialist. So members have reported that questions about politics and what counts as political have caused tensions within some of the groups. The politics are very varied. Some groups resisting evictions, some being heavily policed for anything that's deemed political. And some groups are very definitely apolitical, with the anarchist roots of the practice being obscured. And so we've got a quote here that there, conversations about not making it political despite the obvious political nature of what they were doing. So, while some of the groups didn't directly challenge the status quo or they see themselves as political, many of them were, of course, set up to deal with some of the inequalities that were revealed by the pandemic. Some other political tensions within the groups, and particularly between more anarchist-inspired models and more mainstream, perhaps even bourgeois models, played out in debates around centralization versus local coordination and charity versus solidarity models. So some of the groups are looking to develop themselves into charities, while others have developed food co-ops and solidarity funds. Next slide, please. So I want to just look back now to the development of platform technology, which has helped to facilitate these groups, and in relation to social cooperation in particular. The development of Web 2.0, which is the more interactive version of the World Wide Web in the early 2000s, actually inspired utopian ideas about an economy based on contribution, sharing, and social cooperation, primarily through peer-to-peer relations. So things like Wikipedia, Creative Commons. And it was hoped that this would have wide-reaching consequences and maybe leading to a better mode of capitalism, or even replacing the capitalist system altogether. I haven't done a lot of work on this, but I noticed in researching for this paper that while it wasn't referenced directly at the time, this seems to echo Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread, in which he also proposed a decentralized system of economics based on mutual exchange of voluntary cooperation. There are also other couple of points to make that it's worth noting that, social movements, the way that social movements are organized really shifted at this point. And that also within the peer-to-peer community, there were tensions around power relations, and that sometimes the informal horizontal models they were using, power tended to operate, informally, hidden in more hidden ways, and using things like charisma rather than democratic accountability. That's not always the case, but it was just a tendency there. And some of these things we see in parallel now with the COVID mutual aid groups. Also, what we saw coming out of the financial crisis was the emergence of the sharing economy. So this is a co-option and marketization of capital by this ability and desire to contribute and share. So things like Uber and Airbnb. Just briefly, before we move on from this slide, these images are stills from a video promoting a book by Charles Ledbetter, 2008, called We Think. And he was an advisor to Tony Blair, so very mainstream, really kind of, talking about the kind of utopian ideas about mass innovation and sharing on the level of communities in the internet. So in terms of this monetization of sharing, if you can go to the next slide, please. This has also been prevalent during the pandemic, with an extension of the sharing economies into areas it hadn't been before. So you can order a prescription to be picked up and delivered the same day, or advertise yourself as an unpaid carer. Some local councils even directed would-be mutual aiders to an app called Tribe Volunteer. So here are a few apps that sprang up, and a whole plethora of apps appeared as quickly as the end of 2020. With tech entrepreneurs disrupting the mutual aid market, And this, of course, undermines to some extent the horizontal self-organisation of mutual aid groups and also the pay and conditions of frontline workers as well. In addition to this, there are also similar issues within the mutual aid groups around power dynamics and decision making, and particularly around the platform technology with admin rights and access issues, creating tensions around democratic accountability. So I want to now place this within the context of state mechanisms of capture and questions of power and governance. For Kropotkin, the rise of the state is the main force for mechanisms of absorption or neutralization, and he includes mechanisms like coordination, regulation, and of course ultimately violence. In the contemporary case, the state, we can see, has been treating the grassroots COVID mutual aid groups as temporary disaster relief, which is there to step into the gap left by the withdrawal of the state, and which will then be absorbed when there is a return to some kind of normality. And this, of course, is within the wider neoliberal context in which the state has already been withdrawing, placing more and more burden on the individual and civil society. You know, the big reminder is in the UK, is the big society initiatives after the financial crash, as the state withdrew in the name of austerity. And again, in addition, many of the COVID mutual aid group members have reported tensions between self-identified managers and a kind of internalized neoliberal managerialism, which Rhiannon Firth argues that can be linked to the rise of new public management and governmentality in the 1990s. And that's a form of control that seems to embody social actors with, endow social actors with autonomy, but is also quite strictly controlled. And even one activist has suggested there may be a generational aspect, with baby boomers having internalized more of the logic of neoliberalism and millennials less so. So if I can have the next slide, please. So in terms of thinking about capitalist mode of relations, governance, and these mechanisms of absorption, there are three main interlocking points here. So what has been termed netarchical capitalism on the level of the market. So this is what peer-to-peer and commons-based activists have termed as a technological regime and economic model, as you know, and recognizing this is what we have at the moment, where we've got a kind of, the technical term being the front end, which is peer-to-peer, horizontal, whereas the back end is controlled and centrally controlled and authoritarian, and you can see it in companies like Facebook and Google. In terms of the state, there's a kind of similar power setup where so you have, despite a kind of rhetoric and a kind of appearance of allowance of decentralized organization, allowing social actors a sense of autonomy, but being again actually also centrally controlled and with authoritarian tendencies. So using behavioral nudges, proactive measures, quantification, etc. And then this sort of internalized managerialism on the level of the subject. So depoliticized, self-appointed managers, professionals, directors within the groups, taking on decision-making, leadership roles, having admin rights, and in many ways embodying the cybernetic government logic of the state. And I think the powerful effects of, you know, the combination of these can't be underestimated in terms of, you know, contemporary absorption or neutralization of any kind of mainstreaming of mutual aid. However, for a phenomenon to become mainstream, there is often both an aspect of social transformation as well as the neutralization of the threat that it represents. And there are other aspects that are worth watching. Next slide, please. The COVID Mutual Aid UK website has been updated to include an even greater number, thousands of groups worldwide, presumably in an attempt to try and connect on an international level. And it will be interesting to see what happens there, and also what if more permanent cooperative infrastructures can develop, or other initiatives can emerge. So this is an image of a flyer from Goose Green Solidarity Fund in London. And while at this point in the pandemic there is a great deal of fatigue, I think it's worth being reminded of the deep understanding of interdependency and connection that it initially provoked, and ask, how it might be encouraged to persist, whether it will persist among all the other tensions and contradictions. And this, of course, arguably is the essence of mutual aid. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we encountered some of the problems internally and externally that mutual aid efforts can run into. And Thomas will now give us insight into how things went in a similar but also distinct organization.
Can you just let me know if you can see my presentation? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you. Right. Yeah, so this follows on quite nicely from Claudia, because there's a group I'm going to talk about is also based in London. The title of the presentation is called OrganicLea, Mutual Aid and Practice. So I'm first going to go through the history of this group, who they are, what they do, what are their aims, and then show their relevance towards Kropotkin, and this because they're based upon mutual aid, and they're also a perfect example of what I believe Kropotkin envisioned the food production system should be. So it's a group that was originally formed in 2001, and it's a not-for-profit workers' cooperative. It's formed right on the outskirts of London up here, if you can see. It's got Epping Forest behind it, reservoirs as well it's surrounded by, so it's quite an idyllic space. And the Lee Valley was once known as the breadbasket of London, and their original aim was to rehabilitate this food-growing heritage of the area. It was also born from the idea that more food can and should be grown locally, and it's better to work with others than alone. It runs a weekly box scheme delivering food to local residents of the borough. It has several market stalls. It partners with local independent shops and restaurants. Runs a crop share program with local allotment, so if allotment holders have surplus produce, they can distribute it through OrganicLea. It runs workshops such as mushroom cultivation, composting, and it has an army of volunteers, trainees, apprentices, and it also helps set up and maintain community and school gardens, as well as growing food on its 12-acre Hawkwood nursery site, which it moved to in 2009. And this includes half an acre of greenhouse, open fields, woodland, scrubland. And when they originally took over, it was complete wasteland full of bramble. They cleared the bramble, put the fields to work, and they also built classrooms, an apiary, orchards, vineyards, forest gardens, ponds, and compost toilets. And the group has grown every single year. It's been a great success. And in 2015, they set up a farm start project, and this was to help support and enable new food growing projects that are similar to this. And this is in the form of loans to be repaid in produce. They find land for growers, find growers to put to land, and support and knowledge as well. So currently they grew 7,825 kilograms of organic food produce last year. They had 367 volunteers, 112 learners. They're in partnership with 13 schools. They harvested nearly 1 million litres of rainwater and a carbon positive, and they had an income of 912,000, but this is all reinvested back into the group or into similar not-for-profit workers' cooperatives. And there's a video here which we can show, which will give you a little bit more idea of what they do.
We were set up very clearly with the aim that more food can and should be grown in London, but also the social benefits that take place when people come together to grow food, the emphasis being on growing food, the practical work, the motivation that comes when you take control of your own situation, and food couldn't be a closer thing to your own situation, but also the transformation that takes place when you do that together. And we always organise activities so that people that come from all different walks of life. It's a very mixed site. We call it a community of sorts. It's definitely a community of all sorts.
OrganicLea is a family or network of people in East London who want to take action to produce a better food system. And we do that in a number of ways. We grow food here at our plant nursery site. We grow a lot of food for the community. We distribute food through our market stalls, through our box scheme, and through some restaurant and cafe partners. We make sure that food is getting out there throughout East London. Support others to do the same. So we work with specific groups, young people, that's them, of course, it's a support environment for them to grow food. We run informal and formal training opportunities here. You can come and volunteer and learn food growing skills, or do courses here in food growing and associated land skills. And we also work at a regional, national, international level to make sure the changes we're creating at a local level are amplified outwards across the region, across the country, across the world, ultimately, by putting through various networks that operate at those levels.
The amazing thing about OrganicLea is that the people that come through the gates are as diverse as all the plants that we grow here on site.
You can come here if you're a PhD student studying the similarity between soil microbes and human community. You can come here if you're with a local drugs and alcohol recovery program. You can come here if you're a migrant with a regular status. Every single one of those people has been here today. You would have seen, without knowing it, every single one of those people here today. And that's also the magic of this place. You don't come with a label on your forehead. You come, you get involved, and people take you for exactly who you are at that moment when you are sowing that beetroot seed. And we are together.
Sustainability and living lightly on the land. That's what, in a nutshell, that's what permaculture is. The butterfly effects and where it goes is limitless, but ultimately it's about living lightly on the land and developing or designing it in a sustainable way.
And what food sovereignty is saying is that people have a right not just to a basic calorific value, but to healthy food, culturally appropriate food, food that's grown with the consideration of building communities and building skills and knowledge and livelihoods, rather than making profits. With food that's grown with the consideration of the local and international environment. And one way of ensuring this happens is that food production needs to take on board and give control and power to food providers.
So I hope that shows you a little bit of the site and gives you more of an idea of what they do. On the next slide, I've got an actual map of the site. That video was mainly filmed on the entrance field, the glass house, and the spring fields. But coming down, they also have a huge salad terrace here, and this is their flagship crop. They recently had a 2-week build camp where they built a woodland classroom from cob. Here's their apiary, and this is just for pollination. They don't take any of the honey from the bees. They've got orchards, the vineyards. The wildlife corridor is where an old manor house used to stood in the 19th century, and they've built here ponds, wildflower beds. And the old kitchen garden is what used to grow vegetables for that old manor house, so it's the most fertile part of the site. And every year they have just one big bumper crop here. And if anyone was listening to Natalia's presentation this morning, they heard about Sophie Kropotkin harvesting potatoes, and Sophie would be happy that this year we're harvesting a huge amount of potatoes from that old kitchen garden. And finally, their vision, what they're trying to achieve is, as we heard in the video, they want access to land, seed and water. They want this to be easy, non-discriminatory, and the non-commoditization of any of these. They're after food sovereignty, which puts those who produce and consume the food at the heart of food systems. They want a just production and trading system. They want food to be grown and consumed as locally as possible, as small a field to fork chain as possible, and to be owned by the workers. They use ecologically sound and sustainable methods. They're highly influenced by permaculture. They work with nature, not against it, and you can see this in their organic principles, and they have many programs that maintain biodiversity. But this is just part of a bigger aim, really, and that is social justice as a whole. So they want to see a system that puts people before profit, and one that is based on equality and solidarity. And of course, this depends upon cooperation, taking collective responsibility and direct ownership. So how does this relate to Kropotkin? And once again, Natalia did a great introduction from this morning. where we learnt about the Kropotkin's passion for food, and then we see this passion in all of Kropotkin's work. In mutual aid, we learn that the securing of food was the most important part of animal and early human societies, and by securing food together, it allowed evolutionary progress and development. In The Conquest of Bread, 2 chapters are dedicated to food, and of course, as well as the title. In this, we learn that food is integral for the success of revolution, and the failure of past revolutions, Kropotkin argues, might have been down to the lack to secure food. In Fields, Factories and Workshops, he discusses the possibilities of agriculture and what an alternative food production system would be like. And he also helped found the anarchist journal Bread and Liberty. I was trying to find an actual copy of it, but I don't know if that is one. And from this, we learn important features that Kropotkin thinks is required for a just food production system, and this is decentralization. It needs to be worker-owned, should be based upon mutual aid, and put the well-being of all at its heart. And he also talks in Fields, Factories and Workshops about the integration of labour, how we should combine brain and manual work, or the integration of labour, so the division labour, as Adam Smith claimed. And once again, this was just, the food production system was just part of a wider systematic change for Kropotkin. And I could have found even more quotes than this that just stress the importance of agriculture for Kropotkin. He said the question of bread must take precedence. He calls for people to return to the land, to recruit the strength in agriculture. We, the utopian dreamers, we shall consider the question of bread. And I'll just quote this one in the middle here in full. It says, "To know what you eat and how it is produced is a question of public interest. The day when everybody will have understood that this question is infinitely more important than all the parliamentary debates of the present time, on that day the revolution will be an accomplished fact." And Kropotkin thought that eventually all countries and societies would become their own producers and consumers of everything, including food. But what was actually happening when he was writing these books, and as we'll see later what is continuing to happen today, is that people were abandoning the land. He says that agriculture went down in all directions, and the fields of Britain were starved of labour. The passage at the bottom and the table on the bottom right are actually taken from Fields, Factories and Workshops. And I'm sure people have read these and they're quite dense with data. So what I've done here is try to condense that as much as possible and show the abandonment of the land in these graphs here. So you see everything has fallen, apart from wheat and cattle, which have gone up very small, and compared to the population, it hasn't really gone up at all. But he also talks about, as well as the abandonment, the possibilities of agriculture. He talks about knowing one man who was self-sufficient on 1/20th of an acre of land, but it's generally accepted that 1/4 of an acre would be enough for one person or a couple. In Fields and Factories and Workshops, he talks about in Chicago how one man's yearly labour yielded enough yearly flour for 250 men. In Paris, he works out that 58 work days of 5.5 hours from only half of the adult male population would be enough to supply Paris with all the bread, milk, meat, vegetables, and fruit. And similarly, he says the UK could easily produce for 90 million inhabitants. It opens Conquest of Bread course with a chapter called Our Riches, and in this, he makes us realise that we already possess sufficient to provide abundantly for all. And the one thing that has actually gone up in agriculture is productivity, and this is the one part where Kropotkin was right, as he says we cannot foresee what is the limit of the productivity of a few acres of land. And of course, today the abandonment has continued. There's a report here from the Agriculture in the United Kingdom, which I'm going to rely on, but also headlines like this are becoming common in England, especially after Brexit, where we see the rationing of food, empty supermarket shelves. And we learn that less than 10% of the fruit we eat is grown in the UK, and half the vegetables are imported. Overall, we import 45% of our food, 41.5 billion tonnes, and this is a 23% increase from just 10 years ago. We're also depleting the soil with our use of chemicals. There's a 24% decrease in nitrogen, a 46% decrease of phosphate in only 20 years, and some extreme pessimists say there are only 20 harvests left at current productive rates. So we should continue to see how agriculture has gone down in all directions. In the croppable area, the utilised agricultural area, the cereal crop area, the number of cattle, labour force have all decreased. And just this week, when I was preparing for this presentation, I saw these two headlines. So UK food firms are lacking agricultural workers, and they're trying to get prisoners to do this, as well as, of course, McDonald's runs out of milkshake in England, Scotland and Wales. If this doesn't cause a revolution, I don't know what will. So the question when we say that Britain or any society should be self-sufficient always greet with the question that, is it possible? And of course, Kropotkin proved that it was on productivity rates at the end of the 19th century. This was updated in 1975 by Kenneth Mallenby, and he said it was possible as long as we eat less meat. The Land magazine updated this in 2008, and they did it through different agricultural forms. So, for example, they did a vegan diet using chemicals, they did permaculture with the use of livestock, organic with livestock, etc. And they said any form we chose, it is possible. And there's also books such as Waste Uncovering the Global Food Scandal, and articles such as We Already Grow Enough Food for 10 million people and Still Can't End Hunger. So we actually already grow enough food, it's just the way that it's distributed, the fact that they put profit before people. Once again, the Land magazine's updated of Mellenby's book. It's quite dense with data, as with Kropotkin. I've tried to condense it as much as I can here. But we can see Mellenby, he worked out that even if to feed the whole of the UK, we'd have 7.8 million spare hectares. The chemical vegan was the most productive. That would leave us with 15.6 million hectares. Organic with livestock was the least productive, which would only leave us with 2.6 million hectares. But we can see how they're all possible. And the UK is a good example to use because it's so densely populated. It's more densely populated than China, Pakistan. And I learned how poor I was at mathematics when I tried to update these statistics in the week. I spent a whole night on it. In the end, I went for the simplified version and simply updated it to the population today, which is 68.3 million. And the least productive agricultural form we could do was organic livestock. And on the Land magazine's working out, today this would only feed 64.9 million, which is only 95% of the productivity. And this, of course, I was gutted when I learned this, but then I realized, so I went back to the data, updated the productivity, but even with the productivity increase, it could only feed 99.7% of the population. So once again, was gutted, went back to the data again and realized that this was, if every single person, including children and babies, were receiving 2,767 calories. So if we take that down for children and babies, we can just about feed the population, but we are coming to the limit. But this is, of course, only with organic with livestock. I think with the chemical vegan use, you could still have about 10 million spare hectares. So how do these two relate? So with OrganicLea and Kropotkin, they both believe that well-being of all should be at the heart of the food production system. We should put the community first, people before profit. I quote from OrganicLea where they say, people and community are considerations just as important to us as soil and production are. We believe that in the community, as on the land, the web of connections and relationships between all elements is what keeps the system healthy and balanced. And I believe that they're also based on mutual aid, as Kropotkin talks about the extension of mutual aid from the stem to the federation of stems to eventually the nation. With the practice of permaculture, I believe we see this extended once again, how it goes from the species to interspecies and finally extended to the earth itself. We work with the earth to produce what we need. Both, of course, put education at the heart of it. Kropotkin talks about the combination of brain and manual work. If you go and volunteer OrganicLea, they're going to offer to educate you as well, get qualifications, put you on courses. And of course, both argue for a decentralized and direct ownership. It should be grown, distributed, consumed locally. Once again, I quote from OrganicLea, we believe in cooperation and mutual responsibilities rather than hierarchies. And both call to people to go back to the land. We need to, OrganicLea want to rehabilitate the food growing heritage, and they encourage people to come, the same as Kropotkin, they've called for people to go back to the land as well. And on the right, we see a salad bed that is on the salad terrace. And this is named after Peter Kropotkin in his honour. But it's important to stress that a lot of the cult members are influenced by Kropotkin, but others have never heard of him or are not anarchists at all. A lot of the volunteers, 367 of them, and many of them, it's a diverse community. A lot of them have not heard of anarchism or Kropotkin either. So, and of course, both also argue for systematic change. Food production is just the beginning, and it's probably the best place to start as well. So to conclude, I've just got a few quotes from Kropotkin, which I'd like to say. I think the first one's relevant to a conference which is usually attended by academics, and it says, "We civilized men and women know everything. We have settled opinions upon everything. We only know nothing about whence the bread comes which we eat. We do not know how it is grown, what pain it costs those who grow it, what is being done to reduce their pains. We are more ignorant than savages in this respect, and we prevent our children from obtaining this sort of knowledge." So most people here, of course, are fans of Kropotkin. They want to see a society that he preaches for. But of course, this depends on organisations and food predictions and little systems such as this. And with quotes like this, it took me back to the time I've actually spent organically as well. It says, "These hours of work would become hours of recreation spent among friends and children in beautiful gardens. Happy crowds of occasional labourers will cover these acres with crops, guided in the work and experiments partly by those who know agriculture, but especially by the great and practical spirit of a people roused from long slumber and illuminated by that bright beacon, the happiness of all." And finally, once again, another quote from him said, "Neither around London nor still less further did I see men in fields, and it would make me happy today that if Kropotkin did his walk again, he would see people in the fields and working the land on this small corner of London." And just to conclude, it organically offers a creative, practical critique and alternative to the current food system. It shows that another world is possible and also preferable, and they closely align to how Kropotkin envisioned the food production should be. And they're simply one of many growing community food projects. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, for your wonderful introduction to OrganicLea, and also for showing us a project that kind of extends this moment of interconnection that Claudia was talking about, which seems to have been crisis-ridden and fragile in the case of the COVID relief funds, which might be more durable in your case. Okay, I'm looking forward to your questions. I've already got one in the chat. Michael, if you want, you can join us on screen. I can also read out the question. All right, I'll just begin reading it out. You can join us anytime. Oh, no, there you are. Okay, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. So for Lee, he's already answered one of my questions by giving me or providing the link. I was really interested to hear about the work on empathy in rats.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Just as I alluded to briefly, there over the last 10 or 10 years or so, there's been a number of studies on empathy in non-humans. This was pretty much unheard of before that. And some of them, naturally enough, started looking at primates, but these rodent systems have become a really interesting one to do this because, you have a lot of control over the system. And it's particularly interesting if you, in fact, can see empathy in creatures that we don't typically associate with empathy and in animals that have relatively small brains. And so basically, this is the work of my student. Her name is Carolyn Driscoll, and it's her PhD thesis. Basically, what we have is this arena set up. And we work with pairs of rats. And these rats have lived together for a couple of weeks, so they know each other and they're same sex and everything. So there's no mating stuff going on. So they know each other. And then basically, we take one of the rats and we put them in this big arena inside a canister, inside like a canister. And the canister, they can breathe in there fine. But it's kind of tight for them. They don't like it. They can move around a little, but they don't like it. There's a door to that canister, but the door can only be opened from the outside. And the other rat is allowed to sort of roam freely around the arena. And we ask whether or not the other rat eventually opens up the door to free its trapped partner. And the neat thing about this, so the answer is yes, they do, okay? But the neat thing about the system is that you can look at all sorts of alternative ideas. I mean, there might be lots of reasons why the rat opens the door that have nothing to do with it being empathetic, because the rat inside the canister is giving off ultrasonic sounds that we're recording that are associated with distress. So one explanation is, well, they hear those ultrasonic distress calls, and eventually they figure out how to open up the door. There's a whole bunch of other alternatives, like maybe they just like to open doors, things like that you can experimentally look at in this system. And it turns out that none of them explain what's going on, as well as the idea that The rats are opening the door to free the trapped rat. If you like, I can. I will put in the chat. I think I should be able to find a link to a video that my student did on this, and it's really remarkable. I mean, you know, it's not just they like to open up doors, and it's not even. Last thing I'll say, it's not even just. So one explanation would be that this is, you know, not especially empathetic, but maybe it's just selfish. Maybe the rats just like to have somebody to play with, which they do. And so the rat on the outside who's running around isn't being empathetic to the distress calls. It doesn't care at all that they're distress calls. It simply wants to figure out how to open the door so it can have somebody to go around with and play with. And it turns out, you know, you can set up experiments that show that that's not it. Even after they've learned that if they open the door and free that other rat, we take it out of there right away so they have nobody to be with and play with, they still keep opening the door to free it later on. So it's not just that they're selfishly looking for somebody to play with or somebody to hang around with. They are doing it to reduce the distress that the other rat is in. So that
is really interesting. Can I have one brief follow-up question? Because I presented on a very similar topic yesterday morning, and my main argument was about the different senses of sympathy in Kropotkin's work, and I was wondering how you interpret that specifically in relation to, for instance, the rats. Because one of the things that came up yesterday was the fact that if you take the Smithian account of sympathy, that might not work for rats. So to make the question more concrete, do you think the rats, not to try and psychologize the rats too much, but if we're trying to describe or understand their behavior, do you think the rats are sympathizing in the Smithian sense, that they're trying to imagine what it would be like to be stuck in the cage, and that's why they sympathize? Or is it, would you reckon more simpler that they just recognize the stress, the agonies of the other, and that's why they immediately go to try and rescue their comrade?
Okay, so that's a tricky question. So the first thing I would say is I think it's possible that they are displaying a Smithian sense of sympathy, even though we're using the word empathy to describe what they do in our own work. That distinction that you were making at the end, that's, so, you know, we're never going to know what is going on inside the rat's head. What we can do is try and rule out all possible other explanations besides the fact that they are intending to reduce the stress of another. And we have expanded our experiments so we actually make it more costly in some situations for them to do it, assuming that if this really is a Smithian sympathy, then it will be expressed even when it's costly for you to do so. So right now, it's sort of very easy. I mean, all you got to do is figure out how to open the door. It's not really costly. But we've created a situation where they have to cross a water barrier to do this. And they don't like to cross water barriers. And the question is, even if it's costly for you to do it, do you do it? And we're still getting data, but we think that so far it looks like they do display this behavior. So again, we don't know what's going on inside their head, but if we have something where they are incurring a cost to themselves simply to reduce the stress, the distress of another rat, I don't know how that isn't a kind of Smithian sympathy. I mean, maybe it isn't, but on the surface, I'm having a problem explaining how it couldn't be.
Well, I would actually, sorry, a very brief response, and then you can go on to the next question. I would actually say that that's precisely what would move it away from the Smithian, like particularly the Smithian model of sympathy, because Smith says that the sympathized passions are always weaker they're similar in kind and weaker in degree, and so the passions that we get from the passions that we get from sympathy are clearly stronger than the suffering that the rat has to go through in order to be able to save someone. So I think in that sense, the emotional stress from the rat who has to sympathize or who is sympathizing is stronger than the physical barrier that is keeping it. So that would be according to some sympathy in Kropotkin, but it wouldn't be according to Smith literally.
Okay. So that does make sense. And the last thing I'll say, I promise, and I guarantee most people did not expect that the question and answer would begin with a long discussion of rats. But nevertheless, one of the things that we're looking at that I think will be relevant to that, although I have to think now exactly how, but I said that the rats that are in distress, they give off this ultrasonic call. Well, it turns out that the rats also give off ultrasonic calls that are associated with some pleasurable event. So like if you feed them or you do something that they like, they give off a very distinct pro-social call. And we are taping those as well. And we are trying to figure out whether or not they give those calls off when they're about to free the other individuals, suggesting that they are in fact getting pleasure, that they are enjoying doing this because of what so they've learned that they open the door and they free the rat. We now want to know in future times, do they give off these sort of happy sounds before they open up the door again, suggesting that they have learned that opening the door frees the rat and that they view that as a positive thing for them. So, hopefully I can answer you better when we have more data on that. So we should keep in touch.
Okay. Yes. And I think, Michael, your account of perceptual empathy and so on would also be really interesting in that context. All right. Billy has one question for Tom, please. Would you join the discussion?
Oh, can you hear me okay? Great. First, everyone, thank you so much. That was an excellent panel. Tom, yeah, I wonder, apologies if I've missed in your presentation, but what I thought was really interesting about what you were saying and like potential issues. So I guess questions relating to the possibility of food sovereignty in the UK. An argument that you often hear against it is that some existing land, which is like given over to animal agriculture, can only be used for animal agriculture because it's like quite hilly and can't be tilled and used to grow food. So I wonder, firstly, whether the chemical and organic vegan alternatives, firstly, whether that's accounted for in their sort of prescriptions, and if it is or if it isn't, whether you think there's any sort of credence to that. And then I guess a secondary question is, if not, is the plan then sort of requisition of existing land which isn't being given over to agriculture? For instance, off the top of my head, maybe golf courses could be quite fun. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it was. They just included agricultural land, so it wasn't taken into account. But as Kropotkin said, like the technology and productivity is always improving. So if there is land that is uncultivable, can't speak, well, we can't grow crops, you can improve that easily.
Okay.
Great, thanks very much.
I actually have a question for Claudia. I found the conclusion of your paper actually quite bleak, and also where it seems as if these movements are immediately co-opted by netarchical capitalism, cybernetic governance, and internalized managerialism within, and you talked about discussions revolving around not becoming too political, kind of retaining some degree of neutrality. Were there also currents within these movements that went the opposite direction, that very clearly saw this maybe even as a revolutionary moment, or tried to explicitly politicize that, and maybe also use these kind of internal horizontal distributions of power to push for that? So was there some kind of struggle there at least?
Yeah, I did try and intimate that a little bit at the end, but I think it was weighted very much on the kind of more absorption, because that power imbalance is very huge. But interestingly, there are food co-op activists trying to roll out kind of micro food co-ops and using the mutual aid group networks in order to do this. I know that they're trying to set them up all over London and in Newcastle and several other places. And what's interesting again is they're kind of very micro, so on the level of the street or a few neighbours, which is about, rather than growing food, it's about buying food in bulk and then distributing it among themselves. And that's something that's developing and growing, I think, as far as I'm aware. And the other thing is, and I don't know, this is maybe very small and maybe not, is the shift on this COVID mutual aid website to being international. That's a shift that's happened recently. I mean, within the space, it's under a year since the difference when I've checked the website, and I think that is an attempt by activists to connect the network to an international perspective, which of course would fit very, very well with the kind of internationalist anarchist position. So I think there's that. I do also wonder, and again, this is a big unknown, but is about this kind of a realization of our interdependency, which has gone alongside a kind of perhaps a greater understanding of the ecological emergency, climate emergency. And I didn't want to sort of introduce another term, but there's a cultural studies term of the structure of feeling, and that whether this might emerge as a new structure of feeling, it's which might seem to be I don't know, it's very intangible and you don't know what's going to emerge from it, but it seems a little bit lost a bit now because we've all got so tired of the pandemic and things. But I'm curious as to know whether that will really re-emerge and people will remember that, and that's something that will be taken further. I do think that being involved in these activist and community activities changes people. We've seen that through people's experience through Occupy, for example, that the changes in subjectivity are significant, and that that experience then means that they will do something else at a later point. So I don't think it's all negative at all.
I didn't want to intimate
no.
It's all negative, but yeah.
I think the difficulty is with coming up with conclusions, that sound conclusive, and you can't, it's impossible. So, yeah.
That's interesting to see, especially the international dimension, which maybe Thomas could also say a couple of words about that, because sometimes with this self-sufficiency and, it seems a little insular at times. And there are also kind of right-wing movements that have a very similar rhetoric, different conclusions and different premises, but this kind of notion of, organic farming and maximize self-sufficiency and also decreasing kind of international reliance on international, connections there can sound disturbingly similar sometimes. But first of all, you have a question for Claudia, please.
Yeah, well, following on from what Claudia was saying about these food distribution centres, OrganicLea have been supplying them, and where I live, there's about 3 within a 2-mile radius that are still going today. But Claudia, you sort of answered my question already. I was saying, it's been 14 months now since lockdown. Are we beginning to see a decline? Are people getting sick of it, or is it still a growing movement? And what, it's probably too much of a difficult question, but what can we do to make it permanent instead of temporary?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I wish. I mean, Yeah, and as I say, I wonder that the experience of cooperating on this very small level might then inspire people to create more permanent cooperatives, for example. That's what I would really like to see. I think, and this was, I actually have a question for you, which I'll maybe come on to, but, you know, I also think that the relationship between the local council and local government structure and these kind of cooperative initiatives is really important. And I mean, that's something that I think could encourage more of these initiatives as well. Can I ask Thomas my question?
Please go ahead.
So yeah, so my question was about the relationship between this co-op and the local council, really, and how that's been. Is it encouragement, tolerance, or have there been difficulties?
Well, surprisingly, they've actually been quite good. The site was originally in the 80s. They used it for growing flowers for parks, roundabouts. I think they stopped using that in about the 80s when Thatcher came in, privatised everything. So it stood empty, derelict for 30 years nearly. They do have quite a close relationship with the council because, of course, they offer courses. These are nationally recognised qualifications. They work with the local authorities of prisoners who have been recently released, recovering drug addicts and alcohol. So they do have quite close, but the site is only on a 10-year lease at the time. So I think that's about to run out in about 3 years. Fingers crossed there's no issues renewing it. But yeah, they don't own the land, unfortunately. It's impossible to own such a big site in London, as you know, with the prices for land. But that's why with the farm start, they're trying to extend it, and this leads on to what Paul was talking about, how it can be, such movements can be quite insulated. So with the food sovereignty movement, that's not only national, but that is international. There's a group called La Vie Campesina, I think it is. It's an international peasants, land workers movement. And in the UK, there's the National Land Workers Alliance. And they do a lot of great work, you know, bringing these people together nationally and then internationally as well.
Thank you ever so much. I would also be interested, by the way, very briefly in the organizational structure of OrganicLea, because we were talking with Claudia about the kind of informal power relations that develop. And are there any safeguards against that in OrganicLea?
So I think there's about 14 actual co-op members. These are given part-time wage. They volunteer, the rest of the time they're there full-time, and the rest is simply on volunteers. And you turn up whichever day you proceed. They'll say, what do you want to work on? You know, they'll have a big circle, put your hand up if you want to do that. So it's, even though there are part-time co-op members, I'd say it's completely horizontal. Of course, as any anarchist organisation will have, you listen to the more experienced people. You know, you take their experience and you take it and apply it. And of course, so Kropotkin says there should be no state intervention with these groups, but of course in today, it's sort of impossible not to. If you want to help these vulnerable people, you've got to work with the council. If you want to offer qualifications to young people, you've got to work with the council. If you want the land in the first place, you've got to work with the council.
Okay, I think we'll close with a question for Lee. Stephen Becker has written in the chat. He asserts that epigenetics has, to some extent, rehabilitated Lamarck. And I think in your talk, you also mentioned that Lamarck is mostly discredited, but not entirely. And Stephen Becker also hypothesizes that the development of mutual aid may not be due to a gene per se, but by the development of learning feedback within the increase in brain processing power, and therefore an incredibly complex interaction between long-term genetic change and the immediate ability to reflect on the environment. Okay. Very dense question. He recommends My Octopus Teacher as a illustration of this.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to answer this fully, but let me just try and do what I can briefly. So yes, the kind of caveat that I threw in about that we now know it's wrong, except for in perhaps rare circumstances, was my way of discussing epigenetics in a talk that really wasn't about epigenetics. So yes, that's the area where there's some argument about Lamarckian inheritance. And I guess, this is, it's a pretty complicated thing, but epigenetics means a lot of different things to different people. And there's no question that much of the work in epigenetics is extremely solid. And it's the work, and there isn't a lot of it, but there's a little bit more of it than there used to be. It's the work on the notion that traits expressed in one generation by kind of a Lamarckian use can in fact be passed down to the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that. I would say that the evidence that these kinds of traits that are Lamarckian, that are due to use and non-use somehow being sort of built back into the genome, the evidence for that for more than one or two generations is very, very slight. And every case of it is open to alternative explanations, which isn't to say that maybe it's occurring in some instances, but the amount of evidence to suggest that it's any kind of prevalent phenomenon is extremely weak, in my opinion. And not just in my opinion, but in the opinion of a lot of evolutionary biologists. I think, I would be happy to put some links either now or a bit later into the chat, or I would be happy to get into an email exchange where I could send some papers, and I have a chapter about some of this in my evolution textbook. But I don't think there's strong evidence for it in non-humans. The second question is sort of even more complicated and gets into an even more nuanced way to think about epigenetics that I just don't think we really have any evidence one way or another for. There are some interesting mathematical models that might allow for that interaction between inheritance of acquired characteristics and learning, but again, the experimental evidence that it's real is in that case almost non-existent. But I'd be happy to get into this more, through emails or chats or whatever.
That'd be wonderful. And if you post those links to the sessions tab, then they will also still be there tomorrow, and everybody can
okay,
at their own leisure.
Yeah, it'll take me a little bit to so I can go into the sessions tab anytime, or
yes,
if I go out I can come back. Okay, so I will try and track down some good references for that and post them there.
Okay. Thank you very much. We've ranged far and wide from the giraffes to OrganicLea. We know now that we can't necessarily use Lamarck to justify mutual aid for COVID relief funds. I think we've made some progress here, and I would like to thank you very, very much for these really fascinating insights into practical mutual aid. And I would also like to announce tomorrow's first panel at 10 a.m. where we will be reconvening to talk about Kropotkin, the personal and the political. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow for that event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.